So we're going to pick up and look at John chapter 6. And part of the scheme of this study is to look at an Old Testament passage and then a New Testament passage that has some echoes of it. The New Testament reinterprets the Old Testament. All of it really points to Jesus, and Jesus is often reinterpreting Old Testament scriptures. And if you read the story of the man in the wilderness, and you thought about the New Testament story that is often called the feeding of the 5,000, you were probably on the right track. That's one of the few stories to appear in all four Gospels with different details, where Jesus feeds a hungry crowd, and he's reenacting in one way or another and reinterpreting this event of God providing manna in the wilderness. Matthew and Mark are so convinced this story is important that they actually tell two different feeding stories in each of those Gospels. And the one that has the clearest connection with Exodus chapter 16 is in John 6. So would somebody read as we turn the scripture page over? John 6 is on the back. Would somebody read that first part, verses 6 through 15? Somebody read that for us?
I can read it. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near, and Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him. He said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up and said, "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, and let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself.
All right, thanks, Earl. So you notice there's about another 15, maybe 17 verses that I skipped here. In between, the disciples go back to the other side of the lake. There's one of these stories of Jesus walking on the water on the Sea of Galilee. And then when they get to the other side of the lake, he has a conversation with people who had been at the site of this first story that we just read, and then they went looking for Jesus because they wanted more information. They had some questions. So would somebody read these last few verses from John chapter 6 for us, beginning at verse 32?
Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." "Sir," they said, "always gives us this bread." Then Jesus declared, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty."
All right, thank you. So John's telling of this story has some similarities to a miracle performed by Elisha in 2 Kings, but I want to focus on the connections with the manna in the wilderness. So here's the slide that I should have put up with the Bible passages we were going to read. Now I want to go through some of the connections with Moses and the feeding in Exodus. First, John, along with Matthew, and they are the two more Jewish, if you will, of the Gospels. John tells us that Jesus goes up the mountain. We know that Moses goes up a mountain to get to get the commandments. Next slide, that's Jesus up on a mountain, overlooking the sea. John points out in verse 4 that it's the time of the Passover, which celebrates God's victory over the Egyptians and the escape from Egypt. This event in the Exodus story occurs a month or a month and a half after the Passover. So there's a timeline connection. Well, one of the things that's really interesting to me about John is it's because of John. It's because of John that we can say Jesus had a ministry that lasted about 3 years. He's got enough chronological references, mostly to Jewish festivals, that you can put together a timeline. Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't have enough time references. The whole Mark story could have taken place in a couple months. Matthew, Jesus seems to spend a whole bunch of time wandering around the Middle East. Most of Luke occurs actually while Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, knowing that when he gets there he's going to die. John gives us an approximately 3-year story with ties to Jewish festivals, including, in this case, the Passover. And one more slide. John has a story of Jesus crossing the sea, walking on the water. Of course, in the Exodus story, as we've already talked about tonight, the people cross the Red Sea. And then, of course, one more slide. There is a feeding miracle, or sign, as John calls them, in John. And, of course, we just looked at manna in the wilderness with people getting fed. So we can see all these parallels to Moses and the manna in the wilderness. Jesus is portrayed here as what some people would call a new Moses, who does signs that lead the people to trust in him, just as Moses did signs that led the people to trust him. So, a good question is, what difference does this make? Some of you have probably been wondering that all the way through this study. Well, why does this matter? Well, first, if we understand that Jesus is a prophet like Moses, which is a phrase from Deuteronomy, this emphasizes the continuity of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and it's the continuity of Jesus with Israel's past. And helps us understand how Jesus would have been perceived by his contemporaries. We were talking briefly about Josh McDowell and his theory that the Bible is one continuous, consistent story. Well, it's one continuous story with some gaps, but it's told from different perspectives. The fact that it's told from different perspectives, I think, allows different people to see something in the story that they relate to. Some people really like John, some people really like Mark, some people really like Matthew, some people really like the Exodus story. And John's account of this feeding miracle ties it back to the Old Testament and shows how Jesus would have been perceived as a prophet or as a new Moses by the people of first century Israel. God is the same God who brought Israel out of Egypt and out of slavery. and continually throughout the Old Testament brings people back as they wandered away, rebelled, or otherwise lost faith. And as Jesus makes clear in John chapter 6, it is God the Father who actually provides what we need physically and spiritually. The form of the verb is gives. It's not gave. It's not will give. It's not something that's past tense. Well, God did this. It's not something that's future tense. God is going to do this. It's God gives. God provides. And it shows, I believe, that this relationship with God is available today. It's a present tense thing. And Jesus says that he himself, sent from the Father, is the true bread of life. What it is that God has provided of most importance for us. And the second reason I think this is important is that Jesus' whole ministry, what he brings, is actually foreshadowed in these Old Testament stories. Martin Luther says that the Scripture is the cradle that holds the Christ child. All of Scripture points us to Jesus. And I got to admit there are a few books in the Old Testament that I don't understand why they're there. I'm waiting for somebody to explain that one to me someday. I assume it's me, not them. But Luther says that all of Scripture points us to Jesus. And just as God provided abundantly for the people of Israel in the wilderness, Jesus provided and still provides today abundantly for people in need. Just as God brought the people out of slavery to freedom, Jesus brings people still today to true freedom. In John chapter 8, just a couple chapters after this, Jesus says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Sometimes I think that before it sets us free, it's going to tick us off. Because we don't always like to hear the truth. But hearing and receiving the truth will set us free. And in the end, truth is really in a relationship with Jesus, and that's where our Christian freedom comes from. Now, our needs for many of us here in North Orange County, and I think this ties into something we talked about in the discussion, our needs may be more spiritual than physical, and those things are connected. It's maybe easier, Dave, I think as you alluded to, it's maybe easier to know that you need God when you know you need something and you don't know how you're going to get it. When you are really praying for your daily bread. So our needs may actually be more spiritual because it's easy for us to rely on our bank accounts, rely on ourselves or what we've accomplished throughout our lives. But these feeding miracle stories, their connection to the Old Testament story of manna in the wilderness, they help remind us that everything really comes from God. And they also help assure us that God provides abundantly for us still today. And I also believe that they encourage us to look for ways to help provide for others. So with that, we'll go to the next set of discussion questions. John chapter 6. Maybe if we take about 12 minutes on these.